our housekeeping. As you hear the prompt that the recording has started, again, I want to welcome all of you to our discussion today. We're thrilled to be welcoming Ava Sasani from the Trace to our coalition community to have this incredibly important conversation around guns and federal agents and immigration. And as always, when we have these lunch and learns, we just want to do a little bit of context setting for this incredibly important conversation. Many of you might remember that several months ago, we hosted our friend John Lindsay Poland to talk about the impact of US made guns in other countries with a focus on Mexico, because we thought it was really important to highlight the ways that we are exporting our gun violence problem to other countries and the way that United States guns are driving the violence in those countries that causes people to flee for their safety. We cannot talk about the issue of immigration to the United States without talking about the role that US made guns play in driving that immigration, including guns produced right here in Massachusetts. So we really wanted to highlight the ways that guns show up in all parts of the immigration equation. And of course, now in the several months since we had that conversation, we have seen a whole other aspect of the way that US guns show up in the conversation about immigration. But in this case, the way that guns are impacting the safety of immigrants and the people who support them here in this country. So we wanted to revisit the conversation. We wanted to really dig deep into the issue of gun violence that's being perpetrated by federal agents as a part of this, the actions against immigrant communities, and make sure that we're really grounding our conversation in data and research to understand the impact of US guns that are now being used to threaten, harm, and kill immigrants and the people who support them. So our conversation today is going to explore that data and really ground us in understanding what that has been looking like, and also get into the really thorny question of what does the work of gun violence prevention look like for us when it's the US government that's actually perpetrating that gun violence. So we are holding a lot in this conversation today. And before we get into that, I also want to acknowledge that we're just holding a lot around the issue of guns and gun violence in this country. We are together at the end of a hard week, a hard few weeks, with stories about particularly the intersection of domestic violence and easy access to guns. And I know that Trace has also been writing about that, and I'm very grateful for that. As someone who comes from the domestic violence world into the conversation about gun violence, I'm glad for how the Trace is really shining a light on how prevalent the issue of lethal gun violence, lethal domestic violence, the intersection of guns, domestic violence, and suicide. So I'm grateful to everyone at the Trace for all of that work as well, but just want to acknowledge that's something that we're also holding today. So with all of that as introduction, let's get into our conversation. And I'm going to turn it over to our education specialist, Alex Pereira, to get us started.
Thank you, Ruth. And thank you for grounding us with all of the history of how we've showed up for this conversation, how we should continue to show up. With that being said, I would like to introduce our guest speakers today, Ava Sasani. Ava is the assistant or editor of the Trace's Gun Violence Data Hub. She has helped create and maintain the Trace's Federal Immigration Agent Shooter Tracker, a database cited by The Intercept, Mother Jones, and at least 50 other news outlets. Before joining The Trace, Ava covered reproductive rights as a reporting fellow at the New York Times. Her writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, the Guardian, and Vox. Thank you for joining us today, Ava. As a reminder to all of those here today, Ava will follow up with some prepared questions. We'll then open up to any questions from the chat. So please pose those questions in the chat and we'll try to get to each and every one of you. Thank you all for joining us today, and then I'll pass it to our speaker.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Ruth. Hi, everybody. Again, my name is Ava. I work at The Trace. My official title is assistant editor, but I'm really a data reporter. So I'm here to share some of my and my colleagues' work on this incredibly important topic. So let me just go ahead and share my screen. Bear with me. Did everyone see that okay? Yes? Okay, perfect. Okay, so we're going to talk about gun violence perpetuated by federal immigration enforcement under this current Trump administration today. So something that comes up a lot for us is, how is this White House different? We know that just in terms of the number of people deported, previous presidential administrations, including the first Trump presidency, did did have huge amounts of different types of arrests, detention. That in itself is not new, and even shootings. That in itself is not new. There are things that appear to be distinct about this particular administration. The first that we continually hear from sources is the volume and frequency that they're seeing armed federal immigration agents at quote unquote sensitive locations. So that can be courthouses, that can be schools, places where previously, and again, this is never 100%, but previously there was a sense that even if there was a quote unquote immigration crackdown, you could still expect to drop your kids off, pick your kids up, go to your immigration hearings at court, go to the courthouse to do whatever, and feel safe that you were not going to encounter ICE or CBP officers. That in a lot of places, including in Massachusetts, has sort of eroded under this current presidential administration. Hospitals is a big one. Again, the caveat to all of this is there were cases where you'd see immigration agents, these armed immigration agents, show up at sensitive locations under previous presidents, but there has been an uptick during this Trump presidency. The other big thing that we're seeing is the arrest and detention, and also just harassment of people with legal status. So we heard this week that the Trump administration is trying to strip citizenship of American citizens who were born abroad. That's just the tip of the iceberg of what they're doing. I'm sure many of you are aware, but part of what the Trump administration is doing differently is going after people that have visas, that people that have asylee status, something that's very, very hard to get, people that otherwise would have, quote unquote, have their papers and everything together. That does not matter anymore. That does not protect you anymore in in a lot of the data that we're collecting and the rates that we're witnessing. That's really the two key differences that stand out when we talk to people who have witnessed the shootings and the gun violence done by this Department of Homeland Security, that stands out from previous presidents. So, who is being deported? There was a recent excellent analysis by ProPublica that found that Trump is deporting the mothers of US citizens at 4 times the rate of the Biden administration. And the Trump administration revised this internal document of how ICE officers should interact with parents. Previously, the guidance had the word humane. Again, to what extent that really guided interactions with families, we're not sure, but it is worth noting that there are concerted efforts to change the way that the federal government is interacting with these people. And I think it's important to remember who is being deported as we go into this presentation more, where the thing that is being presented to both Trump's base and I think people watching this administration more broadly is this idea that this is the work of public safety, that immigration enforcement is the work of public safety. I think part of why it's so important to track these types of things and look at who is being detained and deported when we look at the other consequences of federal immigration enforcement is to remember that these are not uh, hardened criminals most of the time. These are the parents of very, very young children, more so than it was under previous presidents. We'll go into this a little bit more later in the presentation, but when we look at, for example, the now leaving, but one of the most influential people at DHS, Todd Lyons, he stated very plainly to this group, this expo of weapons makers in 2025, that they're not just going after people with criminal records. Being in the country without papers is to them a crime, so that deserves aggressive enforcement. Again, I think it's important to remember what populations are facing the brunt of what is ultimately violence, and really question this idea that immigration enforcement works to promote public safety. Again, we'll go into a little bit more detail later, but just to set the scene of what's happening. So again, arrests of immigrants without criminal convictions by ICE have raised by 770%. That number keeps going up. I did this pulled the most recent stats about 2 weeks ago. I wouldn't be surprised if that increased. There's more than 1,000% increase in street arrests during the first year of President Trump's second term, says 2025. So we know that one of their goals in this administration, which again is stated pretty plainly by top DHS officials and the White House, is to incite self-deportations. The idea is if you witness state-inflicted violence, like these highly visible raids in sensitive areas, if you feel unsafe to take your kids to school, to leave your kids at daycare, to go to your immigration hearings in order to get legal status, the idea is that you would be pressured to self-deport. That's sort of another unique feature of this administration that we have to keep in mind is the visibility of violence is really critical to their goal of getting people to self-deport. It's intentionally creating a hostile place for migrants. So now we're going to get into what the tracker is focusing on. So my colleagues and I have been working to keep track of since Trump came back into the White House in January of last year. We have found 43 incidents in which agents, and agents includes any federal immigration enforcement agents, that's Custom and Border Protection, ICE, that's the primary two, but there are subsets of that, like Homeland Security investigations. So that's what we're talking about when we say agents. Held bystanders, protesters, or other people at gunpoint under questionable circumstances as of April 14th, 2026. So questionable circumstances can be anything from, most often what we see is people witnessing arrests, if people filming them, people following agents. That's primarily what we're seeing is anyone who tries to be a bystander is going to show up in this database or not show up in this database, but that's most of this 43 is people who were trying to witness ICE arrests or people that there were a lot of incidents during the Operation Metro Surge in Minneapolis where people were speaking Spanish or appeared visibly non-white or things like that. That all falls under this umbrella. Give you a couple more stats. We have found 24 incidents in which federal immigration agents shot at people. 19 people were actually shot by immigration agents, 6 of whom were injured. So 19 injuries, 6 deaths. And at least 2 anti-ICE protesters, I believe they were both in California, but don't quote me on this, were blinded by non-lethal bullets. That's something that we, after some discussion, decided to include in our tracker because Those like crowd control munitions, the very often plastic bullets, can still do devastating damage, even if they are less likely to be fatal, less lethal munitions. So 2 people were hit in the eye by those munitions, and they are now blind. So this is our shooting tracker. It's an example of what it looks like. And I can share this after we wrap up the presentation for folks that want to sort of click through. It's an interactive map, so you can scroll through and see it spread out over the country, or you can filter by type of incidents. If you only want to look at fatal shootings, you can do that. We tried to design it to be both, visually digestible, but also if you want to download the data and do an analysis yourself, we're more than happy to do that as well. Part of what my job is for especially journalists, local journalists who want to do their own stories using our data. We kind of help provide trainings and help them get acquainted for that. So that will all be shared at the end here, just a tool that we've been working on. And this is open source because unfortunately, the federal government's never been good about sharing use of force by federal immigration agents. But previously, under the Biden administration, there was an executive order that kind of forced them to share some details so that the level of transparency done by federal law enforcement more closely matched what they were asking local and state law enforcement to do. That executive order was rescinded by the Trump administration pretty quickly after he came back into the office. So what once was a kind of crappy data landscape is now a non-existent one. So again, we are really going off of what we see on the we obviously verify and fact check everything, but this is all open source. So we have a tip line available that people can submit to. We have a pretty rigorous vetting process before we add anything to this database. All that to say, it's very possible that there are incidents that are not in here that we were not able to fact check to our standards, but this is the best that we can do now without an official like data sharing infrastructure by the federal government. So let's look at how much money this effort by the Trump administration is costing. And also, I think it's always important when we're talking about things like this of who benefits, who profits from federal immigration crackdowns. So an analysis that I did of procurement data shows that in 2025, weapons manufacturers received 120.7 million from DHS contracts alone. That's the highest amount in at least a decade. Many of the biggest contracts were awarded to companies that create guns, ammo, and that includes, again, that plastic, less lethal munition that we talked about, and firearm accessories to ICE and CBP. There are a few companies that really, really benefit from these contracts. Gazelle Automatics, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I apologize to them if so, but is a Pennsylvania-based gun seller. They supply rifles to immigration enforcement agents. They received 13.1 million in DHS contracts last year, which is 400% more from their previous high in 2023. It's interesting, this company, Gazelle Automatics, they actually advertise on their site. There's a specific tab for people that want to purchase guns similar to CBP agents. So they're very proud of this association. But that's just a little bit of insight of how much of taxpayer money is being spent on this particular form of gun violence. And I can also share this story that we did for folks that want to see the interactive version of this graph, but you can see 2025. Again, spending's always been high. It got a lot higher once Trump resumed the presidency. So I want to caution this next section in it's not as simple as the government is spending money on this, so therefore they're not spending money on that. But again, I do think it's helpful context to remember that this immigration enforcement blitz is being sold to the American people as public safety. So if all of this money and all of this manpower and all of these guns are being poured into the name of, again, purportedly public safety, what else is being done by this administration related to public safety? Well, the administration has terminated, redirected, or delayed more than $1 billion in federal grants related to gun violence, public safety, mental health, and other life-saving efforts. The largest chunk of those rescinded grants, which again valued at more than 180 million, supported violence prevention programs, violence interruption that I'm sure many of you on this call are familiar with or work on yourselves. Particularly in cities like Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Newark, New Jersey. Those were among the hardest hit by these violence interruption cuts. So let me just share this with you all now because I think it's interesting. I'm going to put this in the chat. So this is a database that my colleague Chip Brownlee put together of the different CBI programs that have lost their funding because of the Trump administration's cuts. Like our immigration shooting tracker, it is not an exhaustive list. It's really hard to do that with, again, federal data has never been great. It's especially not great right now. So we sort of had to cobble to, or my colleague did a lot of work cobbling together data from this federal site that looks at grants and see who lost money. So that link should take you to specifically the database filtered for Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, we found 17 terminated federal grants, which is almost $30 million unspent on these public safety initiatives. The largest cut was for an organization called Community Resources for Justice, which works on criminal justice reform. And then if you can scroll through and see what the other grants were lost and what work the people who were receiving those grants were doing. I think it's interesting to just poke around and see what you find. And then again, because it's open source, we have a option where if you see anything that's missing and you want to flag it, please reach out. We would love that. So back to the shootings and brandishing incidents that are perpetuated by federal immigration agents. We're entering kind of a tricky phase at this point. They're calling it phase 2. The current head of DHS, Mark Wayne Mullen, throughout his confirmation hearing, really emphasized collaboration with local law enforcement. And that makes tracking these types of shootings a lot harder. It appears that a lot of the shootings seem to have slowed. Part of my job is reviewing and verifying video of violent arrests by ICE and CBP and other DHS agents. Anecdotally, it does seem like they're using guns less, still using incredibly violent tactic, but guns seem to have been going a little bit under the radar. So some early looking into why that is. There's something called 287G, and essentially what this does is there's different models, but it kind of allows the Department of Homeland Security to deputize local law enforcement agencies and also local state level prison agencies to work with immigration enforcement and work on deportations with them. This is a map of, it was last updated in March of 2026, so it likely, I would guess that there are more agencies that have now signed up for 287G. It varies a little bit by state and by municipality, but the really interesting thing that we found here is that a lot of folks in places with 287G agreements are not aware that their law enforcement signed those agreements. A lot of the places that sign up post Trump's most recent inauguration have not advertised it, especially in their more purple blue areas. So that is sort of what we're looking at now in terms of gun violence related to immigration enforcement. So in Massachusetts, the again, as of March 2026, the only agency that is listed as working with this agreement is the Department of Corrections. So how this works with the particular contract that the Massachusetts Department of Corrections has, again, as of March 2026, is local officers will screen people for immigration status when they're inside jails after they've already been arrested. So someone is booked into a local jail, trained officers, and trained is a huge asterisk. We at the Trace are trying to find out what that training entails. But the officers who have been trained to some extent by DHS will check that detainee's immigration status. And if they're flagged, ICE, or in this case, any immigration officer can issue a detainer or begin deportation proceedings. Again, primarily this used to be the purview of ICE, but CBP has sort of stepped in to do internal deportations and internal work for immigration enforcement. So ICE and CBP might be used interchangeably. Just be aware of that. And that's the end of my presentation. I just want to add one more thing related to the 287G agreements. If because this is so open source, all of this work is very much just like what we can find by going through local court records and requesting public records from, places like the Massachusetts Department of Corrections. We really, really encourage, if not me, if anybody wants to reach out and has information about 287G agreements that you're aware of or that you suspect that maybe are not listed publicly on the Homeland Security's website, please reach out to us. We are trying to keep track of all of the shootings that are done and all of the brandishing incidents, all of the law enforcement that's working with this agency. But it's tricky to do. So if you feel that you have information that you are willing and able to share with us, we can have off the record conversations. That is no problem. We're really rigorous and good about protecting folks' anonymity. So I think it's important to mention that because as we're seeing police officers, correctional officers work with federal immigration enforcement, it sort of dilutes accountability where it's harder to know if a police officer is being deputized to do Homeland Security's work. And if in that incident, a police officer shoots a person on behalf of immigration enforcement, that's a lot harder for us to track, which is sort of, I think, why this phase 2 that we're in now is a little bit tricky. So that's it for me. I think we're going to move on to questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Ava, for leading us through that informative presentation. To start us off with our first question, and just before we start on that, if folks could continue to post questions in the chat, we try to get to all of them. So our first question is, how did you get into this work, and why does this specific topic matter so much to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually grew up in Massachusetts, and I first started reporting my very first adult journalism story was a piece for the Boston Globe about Customs and Border Protection and interactions that they were having with student visa holders at Logan Airport. And since then, I've really specifically been interested in the sort of gray area and authority that immigration officers have. And then specifically, I got to working at the Trace because I had just always been such a fan of their reporting. And then when I was doing breaking news at the Globe and at other jobs, it's just I think a lot of reporters have really good intentions when it comes to gun violence, but especially if you're on that like quick breaking news piece, it's really hard because you just end up covering shootings and you want to put more time and context and empathy into those stories, but it's really, really hard to do that with the resources that you're given as like a quick turn metro reporter. So all that to say, I wanted to add more context to gun violence in America more broadly. And then with this current administration, I wanted the chance to look at how gun violence is being done by, again, these agents that work in it feels very much like a legal gray area. So it's just a combination of those things.
I'll jump in with the next question, but just first, thank you, Ava. We'll thank you more a little bit later too. But even as much as I've been involved in the planning of this lunch and learn, as you were going through this material, it's so striking and it's so important. And I'm just grateful for you for being with us. And again, grateful to the Trace for compiling this information. And Alex is going to talk a little bit more about fear in a bit, but one of the things that really jumped out for me, especially as a former advocate for survivors of domestic violence, is that piece around the visibility of violence as a technique of coercion and control and fear, which is not that dissimilar to how abusers utilize firearms in abusive relationships. Control and fear. So that just really just jumped out at me. But the next few questions are drilling down on the issue of how this impacts public safety and what that really means. And the first question is getting back to the immense amount of money that the federal government is spending on weapons, and what can we unpack a little bit about what that means for public safety, the number of guns in circulation? What do we worry about long term, knowing that so much money is being spent on firearms by the federal government right now?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so important that you bring up, your previous work with the domestic violence survivors, because I think maybe even more than the amount of money being spent on guns for DHS is, just to bring it back to the beginning, the visibility of those guns. Like this is very specifically designed, or it has been for the first several months. Like I said, they appear to be changing strategy, but that visibility of firearms, of people with these huge guns showing up to courthouses, to schools, to different communities across the country, that intimidation has a real impact on people who are willing to come forward and, you know, be these critical parts of the criminal justice ecosystem. We've interviewed, myself and my colleagues have interviewed lots of attorneys, and this is not a secret. This is widely reported. There have been lots of attorneys who are saying, "I can't get people to show up to court and testify in criminal cases because they're worried that ICE is there and they'll be harassed." There are people who otherwise could have been really critical points of contact for law enforcement investigations and prosecutions that are just gone. They're no longer available. Just saying nothing of the fact that if, people with and without status are also victims of crime in America. And I think the whether or not this administration believes it, they still, I think, are deserving of a functioning criminal justice system that has become even more hostile to them by just the visibility of violence, the visibility of guns. Um, so that's all. It evokes the similar thing you were talking about to me of that intimidation aspect. There's also this feeling of, I guess, this idea that of who deserves justice is just like what I keep coming back to. And again, like I said, it's not just people without documents. We know that people with asylum who have been granted asylum by the court system are still being, the victims of this specific form of gun violence, but it just degrades so many of the critical parts of what a functioning justice system needs. It also, I don't know, that that's sort of the thing that stands out the most to me.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it's kind of a segue into the next question, again, drilling down on the public safety piece of the implications of partnerships with local law enforcement. And you use the word degrade and, sort of thinking about, we know that effective violence prevention is when you bring lots of trust and lots of partnership and lots of different voices coming together to work on the behalf of safety and peace. And so, if you could talk a little bit more around just the worry that we have about, if there's collaboration between federal agents and local law enforcement, what are those long-term you touched on some of them, but what are those long-term implications for public safety?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I've been able to interview a number of criminal justice experts, former police officers, people that have sort of dedicated themselves to criminal justice reform, and they're really worried. Everyone who I've spoken to is like, we have done a decade now of really intensive work to try to build trust between law enforcement and the communities that they police, to build good relationships between law enforcement and the communities that they police. And again, this is not the universal opinion of law enforcement. We see that there's hundreds of law enforcement agencies that have signed up to work with DHS, but many of the folks that we've spoken to, people who have been dedicated to reform, especially following the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, have said this effort, this immigration blitz, has completely demolished years of progress. Because again, that trust cannot exist if you see people being detained in like just inhumane conditions, regardless of status, regardless of a due process. I think a recent analysis came out of there's more habeas corpus challenges currently than there ever. Don't quote me on that, but these incidents have an effect on people that want police to be trusted, regardless of how you feel about police officers. This erodes that. I mean, I think we most obviously saw that in Minneapolis, regardless, again, of how you feel about police in places like Minneapolis following the killing of George Floyd. At least the police chief there has purported to try to build good relationships with the people that they're in charge of, promoting public safety. This has completely demolished that. So it feels like a step backwards, I think, in that careful, very delicate building of trust.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think continuing on that point, I think and expanding on what you've said, even, we focus a lot on the violence itself. But also how does, I think you mentioned it earlier, the fear and the intimidation and those practices impact the way people live day to day and their functionality? And then also what does that mean for the broader community, whether that be just the geographical place or them as a whole entity?
Yeah, I think it's the short answer is that we don't know at this point. We don't know all of the downstream consequences of very visible, very extreme violence. Um, I mean, something that I know is coming up, particularly with tax season this month, is there's a concern that undocumented immigrants are scared of filing taxes because we know that the IRS is sharing data with the Trump administration and they don't want to be flagged by ICE if they file. Will they give away their, will they, that create, put sort of a target on their back? And if that is true, that's a huge, huge loss in very critical tax revenue for the federal government, for state governments. It's it's really hard to quantify all of the different ways in which, I mean, we saw it again in Minneapolis when the the presence of agents there was really intense. You have people who don't show up to work because they're scared. I mean, just anecdotally, we've been interviewed so many people who, I just interviewed this grandmother who didn't wasn't was just like heartbroken about this, but she wasn't able to go to her grandchild's christening, because in the couple blocks it would take to walk from her house to their local church, there were so many different, and this was a couple months ago, but she was describing that there were so many different points where ICE officers had been parked, where unmarked vans had been parked. That's the other thing that we haven't even talked about. A lot of these people are in plain clothes, so it just, if I'm sure many of you have seen the videos, it just looks like a kidnapping. It's really, really scary. So those, from like really big macro significant things like tax revenue to little but like really critical important things like being able to go see your grandkid, we really don't know the full extent of the, the consequences of this fear that's being built up.
Thank you for that. And thank you for bringing up the tax thing. I know also, just to even piggyback on that, I know it's illegal. It's like it's a requirement for your citizenship to have 5 years of tax documentation in order to fill out the application. So even that fear continues to exacerbate the problem. So thank you for sharing that. And then to go on to our final preps question, and please continue to post those questions in the chat and we'll get to them in our final 10. What do you want folks to take away from your work and this conversation?
I think it really just goes back to that idea of who deserves public safety. I mean, I think I'm in New York, but I'm from Massachusetts. You guys are Massachusetts. We're in blue states. So I think we sort of take for granted that when you have, I don't know. I think there is this sense that you can go to for a lot of people, that you will have a place to go to. You can be safe going to take your kids to school. You can be safe going to the grocery store. You can trust that you can go, like I can trust right now that after this call, I can go to the pharmacy and get a prescription and come back and have no issues. This administration, for countless people who are critical parts of their society, who have paid taxes, who are nonviolent, who are not criminals, has made those little things about everyday life feel dangerous and threatening. It really does relate to what Ruth was saying earlier, I think, of just that climate of fear. I think I want people to think about, regardless of if you have documents or not, when we think about what public safety is, and safety from gun violence, safety from being confronted with an armed man outside of your kid's school, I I want people to read my reporting and the reporting of other my amazing colleagues at the Trace and elsewhere and think, well, who deserves that? And if the answer is different than mine, that's fine. But I think it's a question that's worth interrogation, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Thank you for all of that, Ava. And I want to we have great questions in the chat. So I want to make sure we get to them. I'm just going to go in the order of appearance. And the first question is, are the guns purchased by Homeland Security all made in the US? And if so, do they have to by law?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if there is a legal requirement. I don't think so. I mean, we being the United States do produce a lot of guns every year. So I know that the biggest suppliers, there might be exceptions, but when you go through the biggest suppliers of firearms to DHS and to the Department of Defense, they're all American companies like Glock. Sig Sauer was previously previously being many, many years ago, but it was sort of bought out by a New Hampshire-based company. I don't know if that's a legal requirement. I think it's just a lot cheaper for places to buy weapons from places in the United States. Especially guns themselves. There's some edge cases when you talk about like accessories for the guns and ammo, but by and large, they are American companies.
And we looked at this when we spoke with John Lindsay Poland around guns from Smith& Wesson originating here in Massachusetts and how they show up in Mexico and other countries. We should look into that Massachusetts connection for this conversation too. So appreciate the question. The next question is asking about the 287G agreements and if you can say a bit more about the three models and the kinds of participating agencies.
Yeah, of course. So let me see if we have an update. Okay, yes, it has gone up since we last checked. Um, so yesterday they did refresh the data. It's over 1,000 agreements are have now been signed with these with the DHS and different agencies. That's 1,061 agreements over uh 32 states is the most common model, which is, let me make sure I'm saying this right, the task force model. Yeah. So they describe this as a force multiplier for law enforcement agencies to enforce limited immigration authority with ICE oversight during routine police duties. So again, I will say the details of this are very, very murky. I can share an example of what that contract looks like, and it requires some degree of communication. But specifically, what my colleagues and I are looking into right now is what that training from DHS looks like. Because, as has been more importantly reported, a lot of local law enforcement will have less training than the ICE and CBP officers that have been onboarded during this administration. So the details of how that actually works are incredibly murky and worth interrogation. But that is the most common, is this task force model. The warrant service officer program is the another option. So in those cases, ICE trains, certifies, and authorizes state and local law enforcement to serve and execute administrative warrants on undocumented people in their jails. So that is sort of what we were talking about before, where there is some level of training, we don't know what, that happens between that DHS gives to, let's say, the Plymouth Sheriff's Office. I don't think that they actually have this agreement, but just for an example. And then that sheriff is able to do what is typically the work of the federal government, which is immigration enforcement. And again, sort of be deputized to do this immigration enforcement within their own communities. And then the third one is the jail enforcement model. So you identify and process people that they deem able to be deported, which that itself is this whole question mark of what legal barriers are required to hit that. But they basically say that for people without documents with criminal or pending criminal charges who were arrested by state and local law enforcement, it allows them to more quickly deport people who were arrested on those charges. And again, pending. So that could really mean a whole lot of different things. That's not a satisfying answer, but that's because we really don't have a lot of clarity from the contracts that that are being signed about what powers are imbued to sheriff's offices, corrections departments. It's a big point of investigation for us currently, is figuring out exactly what that looks like. But yeah, the task force model, that first force multiplier thing that we talked about, that is by far the most common. That's the one that is over 1,000. And altogether, I believe it's about 1,100 contracts.
And I just want to point out too that the lack of clarity, the murkiness that you talk about is an important data point. Like, why aren't those answers clearer? And the need to investigate that is really important. So thank you for that. We have three more questions. I'm going to try to get to all of them. We'll do a super quick call to action at the end too, and we can send out our call to action to folks afterwards as well. Um, but I think these are important questions to get to. I want to highlight something from my friend Gloria, who's really thinking a lot about messaging right now and how we talk about this issue, which is, have you noticed any overlap or intersections between ICE DHS rhetoric and gun rights rhetoric?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I I mean, I think it's all driven by fear. This idea that if you do not buy a gun, if you do not support ICE, if you do not do these different things, then your community will become unsafe. It's again that promise of immigration enforcement as public safety, which I hope we can at least question, but I think the fact that it's driven by this like nebulous fear of danger is really a common thread in both groups.
Thank you. Two more questions. One is the organizing. What's been successful organizing with the intersection of ICE and state-sponsored violence? Any thoughts about what's been working to push back on all of that?
Well, I guess I don't feel the most qualified to talk about what's been working in terms of organizing. As a journalist, I try to remain, as objective as possible. But I have found it as a person to be really inspiring to see how communities, like groups of neighbors, will work together to keep each other safe. Like I'm sure many of you are aware of this, but there are networks that were established, especially in Minneapolis, where neighbors that had never spoken before would work together to, you know, create like a buddy system where you have a white, visibly English speaker would sort of accompany a person who is a non-native speaker and sort of create like a physical barrier because we know that agents don't like being witnessed. So all of that coordination of people who are neighbors, people who have such different backgrounds, but working together to make sure that agents do not feel emboldened to do the worst of the worst. I think that has been inspiring personally. I can't really speak to if it's effective or not. I mean, I guess it eventually they did leave Minneapolis. The federal presence has not completely gone. There are still agents there, but decreased significantly. So that's something interesting. But I always think it's beautiful when neighbors come out to make sure that each other are safe.
That's right, for sure. And we show up for each other. That's what safety looks like. And I would suggest too, the information that you've shared with us, what you've taught us today, can also be used to inform and inspire folks to get more involved and protect their neighbors. So this is, I think, hugely important. And super quick, and then we'll also do just a quick call to action and with gratitude, as we always do. Just Ernest's question, I think, is also really interesting. Any research on open carry states and the response of ICE? Been wondering about how that all plays out too.
I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm sorry. Can you
Um,
repeat more?
I guess I'll interpret in the way that it landed with me, which
Okay.
is, do we see a different response from ICE in states that are more politically conservative, have weaker gun laws, or is there any correlation between what we're saying with like the political context in certain states and then how ICE has been responding? I get a thumbs up from Ernest, so I guess I got the question right.
I think that's a good question. I'm not aware of any research. It's a little bit tricky when you get into areas like that where you don't want to, the correlation causation issue becomes a big problem where it, they might, ICE and DHS might be more aggressive in a state, let's say, where open carry is not the law, but that might have be due to XYZ factors in addition to, or not at all about open carry. So that sort of research, I think I would leave to more I guess social side. It's really tricky to figure out the connection. I mean, I'm sure again many of you are aware of this. Um, in Minneapolis earlier this year, there was a person who had a legal concealed carry permit who was shot and killed by police. And so to whatever extent that answers your question, I don't think we can draw big picture like data macro level assumptions based off that, but it is a really critical illustration of how political alignment with the current president does not protect you from this level of violence at all. There's no guarantee of that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to start our call to actions to just thanking Ava for joining us today, and thanking everyone in the audience for joining us today to run with our call to actions real quick in our final 2 minutes. Our first one is the Mother's Day Walk for Peace. apologies for putting it in the chat while speaking. If folks would like to sign up, we'll be marching with the Louis D. Brown Peace Institute for Peace on Mother's Day. Happy to have each and every one of you involved. Our second call to action will be our quarterly meeting, which will be a lit trap at the State House on May 12th, specifically on CVI work, I believe. The registration link is now in the chat. For those of you, you don't have to be meticulously typing or writing or copying and paste. I will also email this to everybody after this. So if you've registered, you are good to go. The third one would be our Wear Orange event. It will be on June 11th. More info to be announced. It will be in the city of Boston. The exact logistics to be announced. Our next event is our Pride Parade March. We'll be marching with the city, the town. So please sign up if you want to join the coalition in that march. And then the final two calls to action. One is, we mentioned it at the beginning, this conversation started at the coalition with a webinar that we did with John Lindsay Poland. And since then we have continued this conversation. We're thankful for Ava for helping us continue this conversation. And then for our final call to action at 1 o'clock on the dot, our next Lunch and Learn will be with CFJJ on Raise the Age in Massachusetts. Please register here. We would love to have folks in that next conversation. Thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you all have a great weekend.
Thank you so much, Ava, for just lending us all of your wisdom and experience and data. Just so grateful to you for joining us for this incredibly important conversation. And we'll be sending this information out to everyone too. So you'll have the link to the video, all the action alerts that Alex very expertly spoke about and put in the chat at the same time, which I'm very impressed by, as, as well as some other resources. So you can look for that next week. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.